All right, all right. I think it's just about that time to get started for today's event. So with that, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Cindy Cafaro and I'm a product manager here at ThreatX. And I'm joined by our security experts, Neil Weitzel and Andrew Useckas, to talk about the most recent Apache Log4j vulnerability that's taken the technical world by storm. Not only is today's time meant to share insights and learnings from our front lines, but it's also time to come together today as a community and solve mutual challenges. The ThreatX team is going to be following up with questions after the presentation today, but we certainly have an action-packed agenda, so let's go ahead and we'll dive on in. For today's agenda, we'll start off by talking about what is Log4j, how are attackers using it, and then we'll spend a majority of our time focused on our fireside chat, again, featuring ThreatX's own security experts. So in this section, we'll be reviewing the timeline of when Log4j was announced and really start to explain how attackers are evolving their strategies to target and leverage this new vulnerability in their exploitation techniques. And to dive into the details, it's been in the not so distant past. On December 9th, 2021, the remote code execution vulnerability in Apache Log4j was identified being exploited in the wild. After continuous investigation, a public proof of concept code was released and revealed that this exploitation was incredibly easy to perform and really was used by submitting specially crafted requests to vulnerable systems leveraging Log4j libraries. Now, before we get too far into the weeds, let's take a step back and just start off by reviewing what is Log4j. So Log4j at its core is an open source Java-based logging framework that's leveraged within numerous Java web applications across the world. Its flexibility and its ease of use was really for developers to use logging with a variety of different types of data in their applications. Now, after performing some root cause analysis, a mechanism was identified in Log4j called lookups. And this lookups mechanism is what really made Java-based web applications susceptible to remote code execution. The normal user could conveniently and flexibly add values to their configuration in Log4j, really in arbitrary places by using lookups. However, again, the lookups mechanism can also be leveraged to execute malicious .java classes against remote LDAP servers. Now, that's just some early on introductions to Log4j, and again, just a few bases that we'll cover in today's conversation. But with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into some further details by hopping over into our fireside chat with our ThreatX experts. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our own co-founder and CTO, Andrew Useckas, as well as our boots on the ground SOC manager, Neil Weitzel. So thank you so much, both gentlemen, for taking the time with us today to really open it up and talk more about these vulnerabilities being seen in the wild.
Yeah, glad to be here. Definitely want to share and kind of enlighten what we can. Kind of talk about lessons learned and the vulnerability itself.
Absolutely. And to start off this conversation, I guess we can dive on in by asking if you could do a quick run through of what Log4j really is and how it came to light earlier on last week.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, as you know, NIST or NVD started to pick up this as a public exploit. We started to see that pick up in the wild. That happened, December 9th evening. And so by the time we saw that kind of picking up traction, early on the 10th, we at ThreatX started to see, okay, what can we put in place to provide some additional protection for our clients? Because, that is a very crafty payload that can be put through, but there are some profiling payloads that people are using in order to find and identify vulnerable systems. So, our goal was to try to essentially protect as many of our clients as we possibly could and provide that enough time for them to put in the necessary mediations and patches, because this is a particularly nasty vulnerability, can be used programmatically, through different encodings, obfuscations, and things of that nature. And it can be used for remote code exploitation. So reverse shell malware, things like that, are definitely making this like the level 10 CVSS score.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that I think Cisco and Cloudflare came out and they basically said that this vulnerability was actually being exploited in the wild 2 weeks before it actually became public. And I think what we've seen in the wild also confirms it. So before we roll out a common rule, basically that gets deployed to all these sensors, we do it as a beta. So just to make sure it doesn't have false positives and things like that. As soon as we deployed the beta rule, we saw matches right away. So it was being attacked. I mean, the different customers were being attacked and things like that. I mean, it definitely. I was surprised how fast this thing, started in the wild. And obviously, then over the weekend we saw thousands and thousands of matches for this stuff. So it's going on constantly. And from what I hear, from what I see, it seems like the main purpose at this point for this exploit, why people are trying to exploit it, is to basically install crypto mining software on these different servers. That being said, I think it's going to expand and it's going to be ransomware, and all the other attackers are also going to jump on this pretty soon.
Awesome. And Andrew, you actually started to dive into one of the points that I was going to ask you next, which is, I realize you have an extensive pen testing background. Could you explain a little bit further how attackers are leveraging this vulnerability and really the reason why?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, as I said, from what we see now in the beginning, the botnets are starting to basically use it for crypto miner stuff. So it's probably the easiest thing for them to do, and obviously it's financially motivated. All these servers, all these vulnerable servers, I mean, we're talking about thousands and thousands of servers. I mean, you're going to generate some crypto doing that. That being said, we don't really know what's coming after this, especially since, again, as Cloudflare and Cisco put out there, that has been exploited for 2 weeks. I mean, there could be low and slow stuff going on there as well. So we don't know. I think, as the weeks progress, we'll hear more and more about this. It's definitely not over. We're just seeing the noisy stuff at this point, but I think we're going to see more of the stealthy stuff in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Neil.
Okay, yeah, definitely. Because of the nature of the vulnerability, I mean, you can essentially inject any of your own Java code in somebody else's JVM. So yeah, like Andrew's kind of alluding to, like we're going to see, right now we're seeing a lot of crypto, but I think that, as it progresses and people see, the potential to do data exfiltration and ransomware and malware and things of that nature, that's where at least, hopefully we're ahead of that to some regard, and we can at least get, the public the necessary implementations to mitigate the attack.
Yeah, I think this also opens some more, wider question, more philosophical question about open source. I mean, obviously, everybody uses all these open source libraries without thinking about what's in them. The belief for a long time was that because it's open source and because everybody can see the code, that people will notice these kind of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, more eyes on the software.
Yeah, exactly. So Log4j kind of, this vulnerability proves that that's not necessarily the case. So
yeah, did I see that right? That this was like put in production, or like at least put in like 2013?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's an old vulnerability. It's been there for a long time. And nobody noticed it, which is surprising. I mean, if you look at the source code, it's pretty obvious. It's a pretty obvious vulnerability, but nobody noticed for a long time. Well, I'm not saying nobody, obviously. Somebody could have noticed it and used it for years and years and years. But so the question is, what do we do? I mean, should we scan all the open source projects that we use at this point? Should we go through all the code? I mean, I guess we have to be much more careful with using these things in the future.
100%. And I guess if you could apply this to a scale on 1 to 10, 10 being catastrophic, how severe do we think the long-term effects of Log4j is going to impact the community?
Well, I think, the CVSS score says it all. It's 10. I mean, you don't see 10 assigned to vulnerabilities that often. So I think that's it. I mean, it's critical, and not only because it's a really critical vulnerability, so easy to exploit and all of that. It's also because it opens all of these questions. about open source community, and about using project that's basically maintained by two volunteers that are not being paid for it. And Fortune 500 companies, a lot of them use the software.
Yeah, and if lots of companies are building that, that's the moral question. If lots of companies are building and using it for financial gain and making that money, should some of that go back into the upkeep and securing of those particular packages? So I think it's a good question.
Yeah, I definitely think these big companies should be more involved in the projects that they use, not just take it at the blind faith. That's obviously not a good way to do it. I'm sure a lot of companies are, thinking about that kind of stuff because, again, Java, it's used everywhere. It's a big issue.
100%. And I guess from the frontline's perspective, are we seeing the attacks leveraging Log4j evolving even from when we first laid eyes on it last week?
Absolutely. I mean, because as people talked about, the particular lookup, the Java naming and directory interface that was vulnerable to this. Of course, people started profiling their own applications, and people started looking like what was available through Shodan and other things of that nature. So, and then that as that progressed, people started sharing more crafty and more clever payloads, leveraging either the Java library, like, too low or too upper, concatenating strings, things of that nature. And then, of course, put in additional permutations around, encoding that in either like, URL encoding or base64 encoding, things of that nature, which make these like infinitely more complex. So we've seen that progress over time. We've seen like those attacks go through, their evolution stages, I guess we could say.
Yeah, somebody said it's mutating faster than coronavirus. So
yeah,
we definitely have to be on Twitter and looking at look at new mutations every day. It seems like every day there is something new. And the latest, I guess, was base64 encoding.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. I don't know if you want to touch on that, Andrew, is like some of the decoding that we can do out of the box in our ThreatX platform. I think that was very useful.
Yeah. So we decode things automatically up to 100 level of it. Actually, it's unlimited for some stuff. So we don't just decode one level. We keep on decoding until all the decoding is done, basically. Just go on loop and
yeah, that was pretty useful when we were writing our rules.
Agreed. That's why it was done that way.
Awesome. I guess on that front, Neil, since you were on the front lines, I guess you could probably confirm for us, how fast were we able to get customers protection against Log4j?
So, I mean, out of the box, we do have some risk scores that are applied to things like remote code execution and things that like flag for nefarious activity. As we saw this progress, early Friday morning, we decided that, hey, we need to implement some general rules for our customers that would handle like the profiling and kind of the out of the box easy payloads. And then we implemented even further obfuscations to kind of cast an even wider net around that. So we've kind of progressed that direction. That being said, like we understand that there are infinite permutations and obfuscations around this, and we can apply even more exhaustive rules. But we're kind of like in that arms race of making sure that we don't add additional latencies, false positives to some of our clients, but at the same time provide them the the necessary protections to and the time frames to get in the necessary updates. Remove the vulnerable Java classes, don't allow remote code execution, things like that. So we've been working with them beyond the common rule sets on a one-off basis to ensure that we understand how they're leveraging these, if they're vulnerable, and what types of protections they need.
Awesome. Andrew, is there anything else that you'd like to build on top of that?
No, I think Neil covered it pretty well, but yes, that's it. I mean, we are here to basically allow our customers time to mitigate this vulnerability. So we provide basically mitigating control in this case. We're going to block the malicious stuff. We're going to watch the stuff as it mutates and create new rules as needed. But it's still something that needs to be patched. And also, as I said, it's been exploited in the wild for at least 2 weeks, as we know. So it's not something that you can't just rely on us to, stop the new attacks. You still have to audit your infrastructure at this point. There is a good chance that, something might have been exploited already.
Absolutely, and that's actually a great leadway into my next and last question. So with that, I will preface this for the audience. We will be taking questions from the audience in our Q&A for the webinar for today. So in the last few minutes on our side, please feel free to come up any questions on your side, and we'll be happy to go through those. But with that being said, I guess the last piece that I wanted to make sure that we hit upon is, based on what we've seen, is there any recommendations as far as first steps for companies to start to take to mitigate the impact of Log4j in their environments?
Well, yeah, the first recommendation is update the stuff. I mean, and I know it's integrated in a lot of different software, so it's not always easy to do. And until you can do it, obviously use a mitigating control, like, a WAF platform in front of it. And the second is, audit your infrastructure, because it's not just your code that's probably vulnerable. Third parties, a lot of third-party software is vulnerable to this as well. Things that you might not think about, like, some parts of Splunk or Logstash and things like that. I mean, there are lists out there on the internet of all the software that's been found vulnerable.
Yeah, agreed. And if you can't update immediately, remove the vulnerable class. Like you don't need it. There are configurations to also set the lookup ability to only, now with 2.16, that's set to only local hosts, but you may not even need that, if you're not actually needing to do lookups for what you're logging. So if you don't need that particular functionality, just remove it or disable it entirely. And to your point, yeah, that there's been a number of new, things that you wouldn't think that would have like Log4j in it. I saw it earlier today in SSIS from SQL Server. So it's like in the common jars. So it's not now Microsoft has even seen pieces of this. So that's kind of an interesting side channel.
Perfect. Thanks so much for those recommendations and ideas, both Neil and Andrew. We do have one question coming in from the Q&A. How can operations or engineering teams be proactive in supporting mitigation efforts that the SOC might have to take underway?
Let us know what you're using and where you are vulnerable, or let us be a team. The more transparency you have with the entities that you trust, ThreatX, then the more that we can do to work with you to either buy you the necessary time, whitelist things, kind of work with you on mitigation strategies, as well as figure out like what types of connections you need between your lookups and things like that. I mean, just the more information you share with your security team, the better that they can, operate for you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Neil. I guess one other quick question is, do we have any examples of how we've seen the vulnerability being exploited in the wild? I know Andrew mentioned for an example, like the Bitcoin mining. Is there any other examples that we've seen kind of evolve so far in the wild?
I think, at this point, what we've seen is basically botnets. So botnets basically hitting everything on the internet and trying all the, new permutations. As new mutation comes out, the botnet picks it up and tries it against the entire internet. So that's mostly the attacks we're seeing at this point. That is not to say there are no targeted attempts going on. I'm sure those are going on as well. And but yeah, that's not what we see. Mostly it's botnet attacks.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's pretty much what we've seen right now. We've seen a few more things that have been in the name of research as well, that people just showing where this is vulnerable or where it is being used. But like in the wild, we're seeing it more from the botnet activity.
Yeah, and the motivation is always going to be financial. So we're going to see crypto mining, we're going to see ransomware, we're going to see those kind of attacks in the beginning. And I think targeted attacks might come out later. It will take, as I said, a few weeks for us to see what's going to happen.
Perfect. Thanks so much for those answers, team. Last question here is, I guess, as Log4j evolves more in the future, over the holidays into next year, what are your recommendations for people to best keep track of, their security activity and how that evolves pretty soon?
Interesting question. I mean, definitely know where you are vulnerable, or know kind of what packages you're leveraging, so that when these types of things happen, because there will be new 0 days that come out. So this is just a good example of that. But through the holidays, understanding what you have, where it is, using things like static or source code analysis, so that you can understand what packages are installed, where you are vulnerable, and then using that information to, security is always layers. So you need to add in the necessary protections to either mitigate that or be aware of it so you can monitor those areas. So, I mean,
Absolutely.
it's kind of like the general answer, but what you can't protect what you don't know.
Exactly. And 0 days are one of those things. I mean, you just have to follow the feeds. You have to follow your Twitter. I mean, funny. I mean, most of these things are first published on Twitter. So that's what we follow. That's what I recommend following. And, there's only so much you can do. You can have all the best defenses in layers, and something like this comes out and just goes through all of them. So yeah, just got to be aware of things.
Absolutely. And I guess with that, is there any final thoughts from both Andrew, your side, Neil, yours, on Log4j that the audience can take away with them?
Final thoughts, I guess. You gotta be careful about what you're using. So, think about the libraries, open source libraries that you're using. We're all using a bunch. I mean, that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna, go back to our engineering team and make sure that we know what we're using.
Yep, exactly. So, right on the nail there. Know what you have, and know how to protect it, and know how to react to it if something is found in it later, because that's really the best that we can do in some of these cases of 0 days. And the largest attacks we see are typically against things that are known vulnerabilities in the wild. Things that aren't patched. So have a good change management where you can do things to update immediately, or in the case of an emergency, because that will help protect you in these cases here. Because Apache's already put out the 2 fixes for this, 2.15 and 2.16, and 2.15 allowed for some aliases to be created. So, even if you're running that, move to 2.16.
And yeah, and if you choose to use one of these open source projects, support it. That's the best thing to do. I mean, if these guys had more money, this would have been found and published much earlier.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, both Andrew and Neil, for the time today. We certainly appreciate it and realize that the team is quite busy, especially in these times. So we want to just appreciate both you guys spending the time here. And to really close, for everybody else who joined for us today, just wanted to again reiterate how thankful we are to have everybody on for the holidays after events like Log4j have impacted the community. If you found this conversation interesting, helpful, or would like to talk further, please, by all means, reach out to us at ThreatX.com, and we'll be sure to follow up and partner with you guys through the mitigation efforts of Log4j. With that, thank you, and hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.